We're joined here today by Dr. Mark Kramer. Mark is a Strauss Center Senior Fellow, as well as the Director of the Cold War Program at Harvard University, and one of the world's leading historians on the Cold War. Mark, thank you for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Jim.
Mark, our topic today is Georgia, and from my following of the story, Georgia and the breakaway republic of South Ossetia had been at odds since the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, but that a peace had more or less held between Georgia and South Ossetia since about 1996. So why did violence break out on August 7th?
Well, you're absolutely right. This conflict dates back to the breakup of the Soviet Union. There was a civil war of sorts in 1991-92 in which Russia was extensively involved, though not directly with its own armed forces. Instead, it was providing weaponry and financial support for the forces that eventually took power under Edvard Karkoty, who is still the leader of South Ossetia to this day. And what happened then was Ossetia as a whole, because there are two, there's South Ossetia and North Ossetia. North Ossetia is in Russia and has been since the breakup of the Soviet Union. South Ossetia was always in Georgia from the time Georgia became part of the Soviet Union in 1921-22. And so there were the two parts of Ossetia, and generally ethnic relations there had not been too bad. Certainly Georgians and Ossetians for long periods had lived together well. But what happened during that initial war was there was massive ethnic cleansing that went on. So to the extent that any Georgians were left there, they lived in certain enclaves. And that's the state of things over the next 15 to 16 years was periodic violence, clashes of various sorts, but no large-scale warfare again. And the Russians had imposed the peace that was reached in mid-1992 and had so-called peacekeeping forces deployed there. So this conflict originated out of a situation that was already pretty bad. And then in this summer, especially in late July, there were clashes that broke out of various sorts and culminated in some significant exchanges of artillery shelling in early August that then led to the war that began on the 7th and 8th of August. I should add one quick thing about, if you look at the Russian military operation here, which involved three service branches, the ground forces, the Air Force, and the Navy, and if you look at the scale of it, the number of weapons involved, several hundred tanks and armored personnel carriers, you can tell this was an operation that had been prepared a long time ago. The Russian army is in pretty bad shape, and to carry out an operation of this scale would have required a lot of preparation. But what was needed was whatever you want to call an opportunity or a pretext, and that's what came about when Georgian President Saakashvili ordered a crackdown.
So your assessment then is that the Russians were, in some sense, looking for a fight, and the Georgian president gave them the opportunity. What do you?
That's right. There was a trap laid for him, and he foolishly stepped into it.
How do you assess Prime Minister Putin's claim that the United States played a role in encouraging the Georgians to move into South Ossetia?
Mostly it is groundless and the type of thing I would expect from Putin. I should qualify that, though, by saying clearly the United States had been strongly supportive of Georgia from the time that Saakashvili came into power after the Rose Revolution in late 2003, and had provided extensive military training to Georgian forces. Much of this was good. During the Shevardnadze period in Georgia, Shevardnadze was in power from 1992 until he was ousted in 2003, and Georgia was in very bad shape by the time he left. So Saakashvili did quite a few good things. He got rid of corruption at lower levels. There was still high-level corruption, but a lot of the corruption that had become so pervasive was gone, including in the armed forces. And this is where I think U.S. officials may not have held him to tight enough account in terms of some of his where he cracked down on the press and began not to be particularly tolerant of political competition. But that's not what Putin cares about. Putin cares about that his allegation was that the United States had instigated the Georgians to engage in this supposedly to influence the U.S. election. There is really no ground for that. I know some of the U.S. officials personally who had been involved in contacts with the Georgians. I can attest that every contact that was made was to urge caution and to refrain from violence, even in the face of provocation. So Saakashvili ultimately went against that advice when he ordered the crackdown on the 7th of August. And therefore, Putin's specific claim is the type of dishonest allegation that unfortunately is so typical of him.
Fair enough. So you say that the Russians were spoiling for a fight, the Georgian president gave it to him. What are the Russians seeking to accomplish?
They have, as they had stated this going back really to the time that Kosovo was granted independence, although I think that, again, was not a causal factor here, but it certainly became a very convenient pretext that
Just
basically
Kosovo... When you talk about Kosovo gaining independence, that was the U.S. recognition.
That's right, in February 1999. I mean, this would really go back to the 1999 war against Serbia over Kosovo, and at that time, in June 1999, there was a very ambiguous, uneasy kind of settlement reached. That settlement itself left open the question of Kosovo's final status, although it was pretty clear even then, but particularly had become clear over the last 9 years that the NATO countries were going to press ultimately for Kosovo's independence, which of course the Kosovar Albanian government did declare unilaterally in February of this year, and most, not all NATO countries recognize that. As of now, there are 45 countries that have recognized Kosovo's independence, so it's certainly still a fairly small minority of the close to 200 countries in the world. But because it includes the most powerful country as well as all the other leading Western countries, it essentially has guaranteed that Kosovo will be independent. But of course, it's a different kind of dependence that Kosovo has now, which is on the EU and on NATO. Putin had begun citing that precedent as a reason that Russia might eventually seek the same sort of solution in Georgia. And it again gave him and the Russian government a convenient pretext. In April of this year, after Georgia did not receive a membership action plan from NATO, because Georgia had sought that, as Ukraine did, and did not receive it. It received a vague assurance of eventual membership in NATO, but not the membership action plan that would have been the real precursor to membership. And after that, Putin in particular began to make overt threats about that Russia might seek to impose the same sort of solution on South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia, the two breakaway regions, if Saakashvili cracked down. So there were fairly overt Russian warnings about this in April, and I know, for example, that the United States and other Western governments took those warnings seriously and continued to caution Saakashvili not to give in to provocations. And the Russian government, in pursuing those, basically sought to codify and emphasize the sphere of influence that it believes it should have and does have in former Soviet countries other than the Baltic states. And again, what this war has shown is that to some extent, Western governments have conceded that they are not, at least in this instance, did not send in military forces to protect and defend Georgia against the Russian incursion. Whether that would hold to Ukraine, I think, is a very different matter, but clearly this operation has created the impression in former Soviet countries, Moldova, Central Asia, and so forth, is that the Commonwealth of Independent States, the grouping of former Soviet republics along with Russia, is a Russian sphere of influence. And the Russian authorities have explicitly stated that over the last couple of weeks. Putin has stated it, and Medvedev gave a strong statement about it last week where he enunciated 5 principles, and the last of them was that this would be a special sphere of Russia's interest in which it would have a privileged say over what happened.
So, Mark, how would you assess the response from Washington and Brussels to Russian actions in Georgia?
I think no one would argue that they have looked particularly strong in this, or that their response has had the slightest effect on Russian policy here. I do think, though, that people should realize that Russia could have gone further. It actually could have marched on Tbilisi and sought to overthrow Saakashvili's government and could have essentially occupied the whole of Georgia. I don't think that was ever the intention, but goals and objectives can change in war, and I know that there were Russian military officers who were urging that option. In fact, some have complained that they weren't allowed to do it. So Western response there, I think, actually, even though people don't give it credit, I think it actually did have at least some effect that way. Beyond that, though, the structure of the situation, again, is not good for a Western response because European countries are so heavily dependent on Russia as an energy supplier, and Russia controls pipelines as well as has vast supplies of natural gas. Some of the European countries are 100% dependent on Russia for gas, and nearly all of them are dependent for a significant portion. So that really limits how much they're willing to press Russia. There are steps that could be taken: freezing of Russian bank accounts, seizure of Russian assets abroad, travel bans on Russian officials and even Russian citizens as a whole. I don't expect that any of these steps are going to be taken because they would undoubtedly provoke Russian reprisals, especially by way of energy supplies, and possibly even in some cases worse responses. So I don't think, given how unequal the amount of leverage is here, that the Western response is going to do more at this point than look relatively impotent, that Russia has been able to dictate the terms and impose the settlement in Georgia on its own terms. Having said that, though, I think there are some things that can be done. One of these would be all Western governments should refuse to recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia as anything other than part of Georgian territory. The second thing would be to provide extensive support for Georgia. It's not to say for Saakashvili's government per se, but for Georgia, by giving privileged access to Western markets, by encouraging visa-free travel, especially to EU countries for Georgian citizens, by providing generous humanitarian and recovery aid to Georgia, by encouraging exchanges with Georgian universities and in general with Fulbright fellowships and so forth. So it's a combination of things that could be done with the Georgians, and then by refusing to accept the current authorities in South Ossetia and Abkhazia as legitimate governments and thereby not granting them visas for travel to any Western countries. That would seem to me at this point to be the most that can be done. It's not a good situation, unfortunately, in which Western governments to act, but for Western governments to act in a way that will push things in the right direction. But I do think that over time there might be some hope.
So in this case, the Russians hold the high cards. We may, in the West, hold some cards. But
that's right. That's right. The Russians basically, because of the leverage they enjoy here, they regard it as their sphere of influence, and Western governments have essentially confirmed that at this point. But it's not to say that it will be their exclusive sphere. I think where we can try to influence it, we should.
So what is your assessment of the long-term consequences of the Russian invasion of Georgia for U.S.-Russian relations?
Well, certainly in the short term, it's had a highly negative effect that this has confirmed the impression that the Russian government over the last 8 years has been going in the wrong direction. Clearly, it has been internally. Russia is far more authoritarian now than it was when Putin took office at the end of 1999. And even though he's no longer president, is now prime minister, this war itself confirmed just by his demeanor during it that he really is still calling the shots in Russia. So that itself is a fairly ominous sign. It shows that Russian politics is now highly personalized and revolves around someone who doesn't care about democracy, and it seems now doesn't really care much about having good relations with the West.
So are we headed to a Cold War?
What's that? I don't think there will be a new Cold War per se, because Russia just isn't the country that the Soviet Union was. It doesn't have anywhere near the power, and it also doesn't have an ideological rivalry with the West per se. It really doesn't have any appeal for most countries beyond the energy supplies that it has. That's where Russia does have immense leverage. It's just its role in the world energy market. Vis-a-vis neighboring countries, it has a lot of military power, but it doesn't have the capacity to challenge the West on a global scale the way the Soviet Union did. And I also don't think that Russian foreign policy is as antagonistic and as militarized as the Soviet policy was. So I would hesitate to call it a new Cold War, but it's going to be a very chilly period in Russian-Western relations. If this is how Russia thinks other countries should be treated, then it's not going to be something that a lot of Western governments are going to feel comfortable with. I do think, and this is where I'm concerned, is that we're still in the short term here, and I just can see a year or 2 or 3 years down the line that there may be some pressure in some European countries to think about granting recognition to South Ossetia, or even more Abkhazia, which probably has a greater claim to actually being something like a state. And I just hope that temptation is resisted. I think just as was done with Northern Cyprus, that Western governments should refuse to confer any legitimacy on what's been done here. And I think that the Russian government has changed in the past. It was moving in something like the right direction during the 1990s, although it was far from perfect. And I don't rule out that eventually it could get back onto a more democratic path now, and one that would be more cooperative with the West. Russia does have a lot of interest in maintaining good relations with Western countries. That's where it makes a lot of money from. It has to sell energy if it wants to make money. And it's also where a lot of Russian companies are listed and where Russian bank accounts are kept. So for those reasons alone, purely the commercial interest of Russian elites, Russia has still a stake in having good relations with the West. But beyond that, it also shares some Western interest in countering terrorism and dealing with nuclear proliferation and the like. The interests aren't identical, but there is a lot of shared interest there. So that's why I think that Western countries, while taking a firm stand on this issue, shouldn't lead to a full-scale disruption of relations with the West. There are still some areas where cooperation is in Western government self-interest as well as in Russia's interest.
Mark Kramer, thank you very much for all of your insight.
Thank you, Jim. Good to speak with you.
Good to speak with you as well.